Happy Memorial Day, everyone. To mark the occasion, here's my review of Medal of Honor Allied Assault, along with Spearhead and Breakthrough, the 2 expansion packs for it. What you'll be seeing in this video is the PC version, of course, but it was also released for Mac and Linux. This is a first-person shooter and the third game in the Medal of Honor series. It was developed by 2015 Inc. and published by Electronic Arts in 2002 for PC, later on getting released on Mac and Linux as well. It's also the only game in the series to have expansion packs, of which it has 2. The first of them, Spearhead, was released in 2002, and the second one, Breakthrough, was released in 2003. And while the base game was released to universal acclaim and by a lot of people is considered to be one of the best games ever made, the 2 expansion packs were considerably less well received. Now before we actually get into the meat of the review, I do have to warn those of you who are actually fans of this game and are no doubt already taking to the comments and saying, "Ermagur, DW hates everything." This will not be a video that boundlessly praises your favorite game. This video is a critical examination of Medal of Honor Allied Assault. I do not remotely care if you like this game or not. That is entirely up to you. What I care about is the actual quality of the title and whether or not it actually deserves the absolutely absurd amount of hype it gets. I have played through this game twice. The first time was several years ago, the second time was leading up to this review. The expansion packs, on the other hand, were something I did not play until I actually did this review. So, with that in mind, and also bearing in mind that I have absolutely no nostalgia for this game whatsoever, let's go ahead and delve into this thing and find out what exactly we're dealing with here and how well it still holds up. Now, it is worth noting that before I go into the visuals, that this was not the best looking game even when it came out. There were several titles in 2001 that looked better than this, and by the time 2002 rolled around and it started to get into the real meat of 2002, you saw advances in graphics that looked quite a bit better than this, actually. Obviously, this being a game released in 2002, you have to keep in mind that the texture quality is going to be fairly low because they were very low-res textures back then. That doesn't really excuse the modeling and animation, however. The animations have pretty low frame counts, which means that they end up looking extremely jerky, even by the standards of the day. And you'll actually notice a pretty significant level of detail issue, where if anything is more than a few meters away from where you're standing, at least in relative game terms, then you'll notice that the quality actually goes down very considerably and it ends up looking rather blocky from a distance. Now this is of course a technique that was originally used to deal with hardware limitations when you were trying to render things from far away, but even then it still looked pretty bad even for 2002, and now it just looks positively archaic when that happens. Not to mention there are of course quite a few inaccuracies with the modeling, so that doesn't help matters. Likewise, it doesn't really help that when you do have wide open areas, they're mostly empty, and when they're much more cramped is when they're actually able to show a few things. This leads to the wide open areas feeling rather lifeless and bland, whereas the interior areas are a bit more lively and interesting, but that's something that was kind of typical of the time. So of course the base game looks rather dated, but then you have to factor in the expansion packs, which did not add any real significant upgrades to the visuals other than maybe a few texture tweaks here and there. And while the Spearhead expansion was certainly starting to look rather dated, the Breakthrough expansion definitely looked dated because Call of Duty 1 came out the following month and looked just light years ahead of it. Now luckily the color palette is at least a bit more than simply Bruno Groa Realistisk, but it's not much more, so they weren't quite in the full-on looking terrible territory as far as color palette goes, but they were starting to get there, and that's something that the rest of the series would kind of struggle with. Now luckily the sound design does hold up a bit better. You do have the problem of this being a soundtrack composed by Michael Giacchino and being something that retroactively has become completely indistinguishable from just about any other World War II shooter out there, but it is still well-composed orchestral music. You've got reasonably decent voice acting, although some of the lines do definitely fall rather flat and some of the German accents are a bit goofy here and there. And then of course there's the sound effects, which are not particularly great. I mean, a lot of the weapons don't sound particularly beefy, and some of them were reused in several other Medal of Honor games, which means that they ended up being rather annoying after a while. Before its time, it wasn't outright bad, it just wasn't particularly great either. Which is pretty much how I would describe the overall presentation. It was solid for its time, it's just it wasn't all that impressive, except for one particular level which has been done much better in other games. In fact, when you hear people talk positively about Medal of Honor Allied Assault, that's usually the one thing they bring up, which is the Omaha Beach landing. But oh, don't worry, we'll get there in a moment, because first I have to talk about what really matters here, which are the story and the gameplay. The story in this is that you play as Lieutenant Mike Powell, who is a combination of James Bond and Rambo, who happens to be a U.S. Army Ranger and part of the OSS. And of course, he is the hero that is single-handedly responsible for taking down the entire Third Reich. Or at least that's what the game acts like, anyway. You see, the game starts out in the North Africa campaign, where you take part in a raid on an enemy airfield, only to have your entire squad wiped out. You end up rescuing a British officer from the Special Forces, and you end up going together to sabotage the airfield instead. And by that, I mean he goes around, you follow him, and occasionally he'll drive a jeep very, very slowly in order for you to mow things down with a machine gun. From there, you're sent into occupied Norway and go in to sabotage enemy U-boats, and finally you take part in Operation Overlord to land on the beaches of Normandy, and you begin the proper invasion of Europe. The campaign itself does have some degree of variety. There is a decent mix of moments where you're on foot running around mowing enemies down, and there's moments where you're in a vehicle mowing enemies down with a machine gun or something like that in a turret segment. Or in one particular instance where you take control of a Königstiege and you just drive it around and wreck everything in sight. Now, all of that may sound interesting. You may be thinking, hey, all that stuff sounds awesome, even though you're not really describing all that much about it. Well, before I start to delve into the actual gameplay itself, I need to mention that there's really not much story to this game. Describing the story in Medal of Honor Allied Assault is really going to be not much more than this is the setup for you to go do stuff in. There's no message it's trying to convey, there's no complex storyline of any sort. It's all literally set up for you as player one to go wreck things in. Allied Assault is far more concerned with making everything look cool. It's trying to be as flashy as possible, but unfortunately it just does not have much substance to its narrative. And even worse, it actually doesn't have much substance to its gameplay either. But DW, I hear you saying. Tons of people say this is one of the best first-person shooters ever made, if not the best. To which I have to answer with one simple statement. I don't know what game they thought they played, but it was not Medal of Honor Allied Assault. Because Medal of Honor Allied Assault actually fails pretty fundamentally at being a decent first-person shooter. You heard me right there. I said it fails fundamentally at being a decent first-person shooter. Not even a good one, let alone a masterpiece like a lot of people seem to think it is. The aiming has this slightly jittery quality to it that you can kind of get used to after a while, but is certainly rather annoying at the very beginning of the game. And then when you actually start shooting at enemies, you start to find out all the weird problems that the shooting actually has. For example, the guns actually have arbitrary inaccuracy built into them, and the interface gives you absolutely no indication that it would be so. If, for example, the crosshair expanded when you're shooting to show, oh, well, you're not going to have as much accuracy under sustained fire or something along those lines, it would be okay, especially since most of your shooting is done firing from the hip. Instead, it has a static crosshair, which of course is pretty normal for the time, so it's not something I'm really going to knock them too much on, but it does make it very difficult to tell that your guns are not actually very accurate. Now, before you Medal of Honor fans out there decide to tell me I'm full of crap, observe.
Eine deutsche Kohle.
Now you will notice that some of the weapons that have slower fire rates are going to be a bit more accurate, but that's not really saying all that much in the grand scheme of things. Because this also has an effect on actually being able to drop enemies. It's not just the fact that the game might decide, you know what, you're not going to hit what you're aiming at even if your actual aim is dead on target. It's that the damage modeling is wildly inconsistent in this game. I've seen enemies take a single rifle round to the chest and go down instantly. I've also seen enemies take about 4 or 5 rifle rounds to the chest before they finally go down. I've seen enemies take multiple headshots before going down. Consistency is incredibly important in a first-person shooter. You have to know that when you press the button to shoot the gun that it is going to do exactly what you expect it to do. Allied Assault does actually have location-based damage. The problem is that it is inconsistent in the way it registers your hits on its actual hitboxes. This makes the combat an incredibly frustrating experience on top of the other problems that the combat has. Namely, issues like if you're in the middle of a reload animation, you have to wait for that animation to finish before you can actually do anything. What's that? You ran out of bullets and you're being shot to pieces? Well, too bad. You had to wait until you finish reloading before you switch over to another gun. Speaking of getting shot to pieces, whenever you get get hit at all in this game, the screen flinches, which means that it jerks the screen to one side or another, and more often than not it ends up going up. This means that not only are you having to struggle with the inherent inaccuracy of the guns, you are having to struggle with the camera not wanting to do what you tell it to do because it's too busy flinching all over the place from you getting hit multiple times. Once again, I feel the need to say, if you don't believe me, observe. That sort of thing just becomes incredibly irritating to deal with when an enemy just shows up out of nowhere, because they actually do that. Enemies actually will spawn into the world either behind you or off to the side where you couldn't possibly see them coming unless you just know where they are from having played the game before. And since the enemy AI is incredibly stupid but also ridiculously accurate, you're going to find that they basically charge you head on, but they get pinpoint accuracy from half a mile away. So from any given combat encounter, you have the chance of getting a ridiculous amount of damage thrown in your face. This is especially problematic when you get to certain levels and there's a lot of snipers, especially the now infamous Sniper Town level. But it also happens on the one big set piece that this game has, which is the Omaha Beach landing. A lot of people really love that segment, but I'm just gonna let it speak for itself here. You see, the reason I let the game speak for itself is because, quite honestly, I don't have anything to say about the Omaha Beach level. It is basically nothing more than trial and error. You have to get lucky and choose the right exact path that you need to go on and hope that you don't take enough damage to go down in the process. Now, I'm sure there will be inevitably some of you who will take to the comments and say, "But DW, that's the point." You're missing the point of this being a first-person shooter. In an FPS, you are supposed to fail by one of two ways. One, you screw up, and you just happen to screw up badly enough that you fail the whole thing, or you just don't have the requisite skills to be able to get through it. If anyone, under any circumstances, tells you to get good at Medal of Honor Allied Assault during the Omaha Beach level, they are one of three things. Either one, they're a troll and you should just ignore them anyway. Two, they are completely blinded by their nostalgia and do not actually remember how incredibly irritating it is. Or three, they just have no idea what they're talking about. Trial and error gameplay in a first-person shooter should be reserved for something like a puzzle. Allied Assault, on the other hand, tends to be more trial and error than anything else, not just in the Omaha Beach level, but the Omaha Beach level is the most egregious example of it. The second most egregious example of it is the Sniper Town level, where you have to basically just memorize exactly where all of the snipers are if you're ever going to make it out of there. It is tedious, and it is downright infuriating. But not as infuriating as the sudden realization you will make that the enemy is not beholden to the same rules that you are. You know that whole flinch mechanic where it keeps jumping the screen around every single time you get hit? Yeah, that doesn't apply to the enemy. They still get pinpoint accuracy even when they're getting hit. Meaning that they're gonna still hit you for a ton of damage even while you're sitting there mowing them down with machine gun fire. But even if you somehow, for some utterly baffling reason, manage to make it past those, what are you left with? Well, there's a section where you don a disguise and show ID papers around for about 10 minutes or so. That's basically what passes for the stealth system in this game. To describe it as rudimentary is actually kind of laughable because that's the kind of thing you saw in the original Castle Wolfenstein. Though to be perfectly honest with you, I don't expect most of you to even know what that game is. When you hear Wolfenstein, you think Wolfenstein 3D or the new Wolfensteins, unfortunately. What I'm talking about is a game that was released in 1981, where every single time a guard would see you, they would say, "Halt!" and you would have to go over to them, and they would go, "Ausweis." And then all you do there is just show them the appropriate ID for that particular floor. In fact, that is actually more complex than Allied Assault is, because it's just a linear progression. You get one set of ID papers, and then later on in the level, you get another set of ID papers, which lets you into the last section. That is it. It is literally the exact same thing that was done in Medal of Honor Frontline and the original Medal of Honor. And while I was at least somewhat willing to forgive that on the original Medal of Honor, because it came out in 1999 on the PlayStation 1, you gotta keep in mind, this game came out in 2002. We had already had 2 installments in the Thief series, we had had the Metal Gear Solid games, and of course later on in that same year we would see the release of Tom Clancy's Splinter Cell. Stealth was an established genre at that point, and something like this is downright pitiful by comparison. Admittedly, that is not the primary focus of Medal of Honor Allied Assault, but the primary focus is almost broken as a game. When the damage modeling is so horribly inconsistent, when there is arbitrary inaccuracy for no discernible reason other than just to make the game slightly more difficult, when the enemy AI is brain dead but is still pinpoint accurate from half a mile away even while being shot to pieces, and when the game's level design is so incredibly prone to simple trial and error and just getting it down to luck a lot of the times, you've got a first-person shooter that just fundamentally fails at being a proper first-person shooter. Hell, they even failed at making the tank segment interesting, because the tank just feels kind of floaty to drive around, and whenever you shoot something with the cannon, it barely even seems to react. And on top of that, you're in the vehicle for all of maybe 10 minutes at most. And then right after that, you go into a bridge segment, which is incredibly annoying because you're having to snipe targets on the bridge, and then you're having to mark targets for airstrikes, while also defending yourself against guys who come in from behind you. In fact, at this point, I'm pretty sure the only reason people held this game so highly is because it was the first game in the Medal of Honor series to make it to PC. Because as a first-person shooter, there's basically nothing redeeming about it, even for its time. There were far better first-person shooters out there in 2002. I mean, in 2002, we got the releases of Soldier of Fortune 2, Timesplitters 2, No One Lives Forever 2, and Jedi Outcast. And while the previous year was relatively dry for first-person shooters, we did get Red Faction and Return to Castle Wolfenstein. To compare this to the likes of them, it's just night and day. This doesn't hold a candle to those. And yet, for some utterly baffling reason, people seem to think that Medal of Honor Allied Assault, as incompetent as it is at being a first-person shooter, is somehow in the same league as those, let alone one of the best first-person shooters ever made, if not the best. You've gotta be joking. The only thing that really stands out about it, other than the low quality of the game in general, is the Normandy landing, which was basically something like, hey, we're technically able to do this now. Doesn't mean we're able to do it well, but we can do it now. And I guess that impressed people enough to think that the rest of the game was somehow excused from being garbage. But the fact of the matter is, it doesn't excuse it for being garbage. There's nothing that can excuse it for being garbage. Not even the fact that the developers of this went on to form a new studio that they called Infinity Ward and developed a game called Call of Duty. I had to struggle to find anything redeeming about this game, and the only things I can think of are the technical scale of it for 2002 was somewhat impressive, and the music is well composed. That's about it. Hell, even the multiplayer wasn't very good. You got 3 variations of deathmatch and then an objective mode that I don't remember people playing very much. I mean, really, why play the multiplayer in this when you had the likes of Return to Castle Wolfenstein? It means that not only does Medal of Honor Allied Assault not live up to the hype in any remote fashion, but it's not even a decent first-person shooter, let alone a masterpiece like people seem to think it is. There's basically nothing redeeming about it other than it was technically impressive for its time, which is not enough to justify how crappy of a first-person shooter it is. Which ultimately means that I give it a 1.5 out of 5. I figure the only reason people hold it so highly these days is just that they're nostalgic for it. They don't remember how crappy of a first-person shooter it actually is. And especially if you go back to it with any degree of context for both that time period and what we got in the years following it, you find out very, very quickly that that was all hype and no substance. But keep in mind, that's only for the base game. There are 2 expansion packs, the first of them being Spearhead and the other one being Breakthrough. Now, they didn't really do all that much for the presentation other than maybe updating a few textures here and there to look very slightly better and introducing a few new weapons and models and things like that that are much in keeping with what you saw in the base game. So everything I said about the presentation in the base game still applies in the expansion packs. Although I do have to note, because I'm sure some of you have probably noticed, there's a couple of messages on the screen that show things like NPC count and allies and axis. That is entirely because I had to edit the config file in order to get this thing to run at 1080p, because it normally does not have that as an in-game option, but their engine is capable of rendering it at 1080p. Thing is that ever since I modded the config file to get this thing to run at 1080p, it has been displaying those developer messages, and I'm really not sure why, considering developer mode is actually turned off. So if that bothers you, then just try to ignore it. It doesn't normally show up unless you mess around with the configuration, which unfortunately is the price you're going to have to pay if you want this thing to run at 1080p or anything higher than 1280 by 1024, or even in just a widescreen resolution, period. So with that quick disclaimer out of the way, let's go ahead and actually start delving into Spearhead and seeing what exactly it's all about. Well, in Spearhead, you take on the role of Sergeant Jack Barnes as he lands behind enemy lines on D-Day as a paratrooper, and he very quickly runs into British Special Forces who basically enlist him to do all kinds of sabotage work behind enemy lines. After that, it moves on to the Battle of the Bulge, and then finally on into Berlin, where you fight alongside the Red Army, which is actually really contrived. And much like in base Medal of Honor Allied Assault, the story is basically not much more than set up for what you're actually going to be doing. Which means that it's limited to basically, you are here, this is who you're fighting alongside, this is who you're fighting against, and this is what your objective is. Go. Which of course means that it does fall to the gameplay once again to bring things up. The problem being that this is an expansion pack to Medal of Honor Allied Assault, not a full-on new game. You will notice very quickly that it plays almost exactly the same as the original Medal of Honor Allied Assault, except with a few new weapons in it and the addition of a melee button. Whereas the secondary fire didn't really do anything for the vast majority of the weapons in the base game, in Spearhead it serves as a melee button, so it's good to have in case you run out of ammo. But other than that, you're dealing with an expansion pack that pretty much has you doing the exact same kind of things you were doing in the base game, it's just in slightly different locations. Thing is, it's not exactly the same, it's just pretty much the same. If it were exactly the same, then it would actually be better. because while the earlier missions are pretty much what you would expect after having played Allied Assault, once you eventually get to the later missions, you find that the game gets really irritating really quickly. In particular, there are 2 levels that will drive you absolutely crazy. The first of them is the segment where you're defending the line during the Battle of the Bulge, because it starts out with an artillery barrage that will kill you extremely quickly, and your objective to begin with is to find a medic to bring back to the captain, in a heavy artillery barrage. You can probably imagine about how well that goes, but it only gets worse from there, because then you actually have to defend the line. And basically there, if any of the Germans get to your line, you instantly lose the level. To say that section is infuriating is an understatement. The second section that you will find incredibly irritating is the section where you're driving a tank around, which is basically the same kind of thing that you saw in the base game, where you were driving the tank around and it felt really floaty and the cannon felt ridiculously unsatisfying and that sort of thing, but with the addition of a machine gun that you can use to take out enemy infantry before they hit you with anti-tank fire. Problem with that being, you have to switch over to the machine gun, which changes your camera perspective and makes it really annoying to try to drive around with it. Not to mention, the enemy actually blends in with the environment there because everything in that level is brown and gray. It is incredibly frustrating. Also frustrating is the segment where you're having to take out enemy vehicles using stickies, but because it's raining, the fuses on them fizzle out. Now, on the one hand, that's kinda cool from a technical and aesthetic standpoint, but from a gameplay perspective, it is really annoying because then you have to shoot the thing in order for it to actually go off, in which case you're sitting there like, well crap, now I have to face down a tank with a rifle. This couldn't possibly go wrong. But it's more than just the frustration factor being dialed up somewhat in the levels. This is also just a really wimpy expansion pack in general. You're looking at maybe a 4-hour campaign at most, more like a 3-hour campaign. The only significant gameplay alteration is the addition of the melee button, and of course with regards to the new weapons, they all fill slots that were already occupied before. You just get the new factions versions of those. So for example with the Brits, you get the Lee Enfield, you get the Webley revolver, and of course you get the Sten gun. None of the new weapons are significant enough departures from what you saw in the original game to really matter all that much in the long run. It's, I guess, nice to have a bit of a difference in terms of aesthetics, and of course some different ammo counts and slightly different damage outputs and things like that, but it's certainly not enough to get enthused about. In fact, the majority of the content seems to be centered around the multiplayer, which is a dozen new maps and a brand new mode called Tug of War. Except there's a couple of issues with that. The first of them being that you can't play the multiplayer anymore because they shut down the master servers for it, so the only way you can play it is basically over a LAN or by setting up some sort of jerry-rig contraption through Game Ranger or something like that. Then of course there's a problem where it kind of splits the community because the people who don't have the expansion pack can't play the expansion pack content. And finally, the multiplayer in this game was never all that huge to begin with. It definitely had a community, don't get me wrong, but it never really had the same kind of massive active community that a lot of other multiplayer-centric shooters did at the time. And again, why play the multiplayer in this when there's a bunch of other games out there that are a lot better than this? So the Spearhead expansion doesn't really do anything to ameliorate the problems that the base game had, and if anything, it makes a lot of the single-player content even worse, on top of the main content focus for this game being the multiplayer, which was fairly short-lived. Not to mention the multiplayer for Allied Assault being rather basic to begin with and really not all that great. Even back in the day, you really didn't get a whole lot of bang for your buck with this expansion pack, and now that it's so many years afterwards and they've shut down the master servers, there's really no reason to play Spearhead at all. It's basically the base game, but very slightly worse. And ultimately, I give Spearhead a 1.5 out of 5 as well. But then, there's Medal of Honor Allied Assault Breakthrough, the second expansion pack that was released in 2003, the same year that Call of Duty came out. In fact, this came out the month right before the original Call of Duty came out. By this point, of course, Allied Assault was wearing itself very, very thin. Then along comes this expansion pack, where you take on the role of Sergeant John Baker, and you fight in the Battle of Kasserine Pass at the very beginning, and then you move over into the invasion of Sicily and the invasion of Italy. Like in the Spearhead expansion as well as the base game, the story serves to do not much more than say, hey, you're going to this location and you're going to be fighting these dudes now, so go do it! Because like in the previous expansion, and of course the main game, it basically just tells its story in the mission briefing that precedes what you end up doing. And you notice very quickly that even though this expansion has a bit more in terms of its single-player campaign content than the previous expansion pack, it's much more limited in scope. Instead of about 3 to 4 hour campaign, you're looking at more of a 4 to 6 hour campaign depending on how long you take to drag things out. But like I said, there's really only 2 locations that you'll be running around in throughout the course of the expansion pack. The first of them is North Africa, and the second of them is Italy, because you go to Sicily, and then from there you go on into full-on Italy. Now, as far as actual additions to the gameplay mechanics and such, you're looking at several new weapons, mostly the Italian weapons, and that's kinda it, actually. Spearhead introduced the melee attack to Allied Assault, which is carried over in Breakthrough, but other than that, you're looking at basically the exact same gameplay as Medal of Honor Allied Assault. They even brought back the disguise mechanic from the base game, and made no changes or improvements to it. So it's literally exactly the same rudimentary, pretty much laughably so, stealth system that is actually even a bit weaker than games that were released in the 80s. Castle Wolfenstein. They do spice that particular section up, though, because you infiltrate a German ship, and then you manage to get a shotgun on the ship, which makes the cover is blown segment a lot more tolerable, because now you got a friggin' shotgun. And thankfully it's not the pathetic garbage shotgun you saw in Medal of Honor Frontline. No, it's an actually pretty decent shotgun. Still not perfect, but it's definitely a lot better than the one in Frontline, that's for sure. But really what you find with Breakthrough is that not only is it just more of the same without ameliorating any of the problems from the previous expansion or the base game, it's really lazy about it. In fact, this particular clip I'm about to show you showcases exactly how lazy it is. Observe. That is the kind of level design you are dealing with in the Medal of Honor Allied Assault Breakthrough expansion. It is lazy, it is very uninspired, and above all else, it's just annoying. Especially when you factor in the change that they made to the ammo and health drops. You see, enemies are supposed to drop weapons in order for you to replenish your ammo as you go along. At least that's how the base game and the Spearhead expansion did that. Breakthrough does that as well, but the drops are, I believe, around 20% of what they were in the base game and the Spearhead expansion. At least that's what it seems like. I'm not entirely sure of the exact percentage they changed it to, but now the enemy rarely actually drops ammunition or health, so not only do you have to worry about the game just constantly blindsiding you with enemies and being all kinds of messed up in terms of hit detection and damage registration, as well as the inherent inaccuracy of all of your guns, on top of the flinching mechanics of course, but now you need to worry about having really low ammo counts. Because of the inherent inaccuracy of the guns as well as the flinching mechanics, you'll probably waste a lot of ammunition trying to take enemies down. This means that you'll probably run into numerous instances throughout the game where you become absolutely desperate for ammunition. And funnily enough, that simple change is actually enough to take this expansion pack from just being more of the same from the previous expansion pack as well as the base game, and turn it into something that is considerably worse. Because if there's one thing that the base game and the Spearhead expansions didn't do, it was make you have to absolutely scrounge every last bullet you could possibly find. If you weren't just wasting your ammo for the hell of it, you wouldn't really run into any ammunition supply problems. My guess is the developers of Breakthrough saw that and went, you know what, that makes the game too easy. We've got to make the game much more difficult than it already is. Let's go ahead and give them barely enough resources to actually finish a level. That sounds like a fantastic idea. That is precisely what Medal of Honor Allied Assault did not need. It is nothing remotely resembling an easy game in its base state, and neither is Spearhead. So I don't know what they were thinking with the Breakthrough expansion, but whatever they were thinking, it ended up in the Breakthrough expansion being outright terrible. And it's not something that 9 new multiplayer maps and a Liberation multiplayer mode could fix. You could pretty much consider this EA's attempt at a Sega 32X for Medal of Honor Allied Assault. Something that was sort of intended to expand the life cycle of the game way beyond what it was supposed to be, and really trying to compete with things that were just going to absolutely crush it, like the original Call of Duty. Not only does Breakthrough fail at extending the life cycle of Medal of Honor Allied Assault, but it is such an absolutely miserable experience to play that it actually kind of makes Medal of Honor Allied Assault in general worse just by it existing. And ultimately, that ends up dragging Breakthrough down to a 1 out of 5. Like I said, it is a downright miserable experience to play through Medal of Honor Allied Assault Breakthrough. It's bad enough playing through Allied Assault and Spearhead because they're just such ridiculously frustrating experiences. But when you hop into Breakthrough and one of your first experiences is trying to navigate a literal minefield with a mine detector that just makes noise, you know it's not going to be a good time. But that doesn't tell you just how bad it gets. So there you have it, folks. My review of not only Medal of Honor Allied Assault, one of the most overrated games of all time, but also its 2 expansion packs, one of which is pretty much more of the same but slightly worse, and the other of which is more of the same but considerably worse. Thanks for watching.